I'm only going to be up here for about 30 seconds to intro your speaker. So I am actually from Storyblock. The reason that we've got Lottie here and talking, Lottie is from Lab, who is one of our key partners. I just got back in. We did our JoyConf over the last 3 days in Amsterdam, so bear with me if you talk to me and I'm a little bit loopy. But a lot of our speakers ended up in Amsterdam. We looked at this as a huge opportunity to give you something a little bit different today. So Lottie's going to be talking to you more about behavioural aspect and how you can design your content so that it fits the behaviours of your customers and your visitors. From my side, from Storyblock's perspective, we are a headless CMS. We're enterprise grade and we are loved by both developers and marketers. So we are built for you, but we then free up your developers to work with the tools and the technologies that they like to work with. Headless is a bit of a crazy world. I'm happy to dive into that in more detail. Please come out and see us later on. But just in terms of the work that we do, we were founded in 2017. We have grown to be a global presence. We've got some really strong names, both in the UKI and beyond, so the likes of a Virgin Media O2, Octopus Energy, Greg's, my personal favourite. And we'd love to talk to you more, but for now I'm going to hand over to Lottie, who's going to take you through her slides. It's a fantastic presentation. I hope you enjoy it.
Oh, thanks. Hi, everybody. I have to apologise for my seated position. I damaged my ankle doing taekwondo, of all things, and so I'm going to just gently sit down, but apologies for that. Thank you so much for coming today. I really appreciate you all being here. Hopefully you're going to be able to go away from today with some inspiration and some ideas of what you can be doing kind of tomorrow, or even maybe today, off the back of my talk. So yes, I'm here to talk to you about designing for decisions, and ultimately thinking about, when you're looking at your content strategy, how you need to be considering more about the kind of customer and behaviours when you're doing that. So ultimately, if we take it back to the real sort of basics, when anyone is going to a website, they are trying to solve a problem. That is ultimately what they are trying to do. So they might be looking at kind of the investigation stage or potentially kind of that point of purchase. But actually, ultimately, that is still a problem that they're trying to solve at that point. And we've all been in website experiences, and myself, even this week, have had some of those experiences which have been really difficult, and we've simply close the browser. It's just not working for you. Regardless of how you feel about the brand, that experience at that point in time has been so frustrating, you've switched off. And these can be for a variety of reasons. So the search bar, returning irrelevant content, which is one of my personal bugbears. The content was too long, didn't read. You know, you've got this information, you've come through, you've searched about information, you've come through to the website, and actually the content there's a huge amount of information there. I haven't got the time or the inclination in order to actually digest this. Or the website simply doesn't answer the question that I asked in the first place. And particularly if we're looking at kind of the AI overviews and potentially driving your traffic through to the sites, it might be providing some of that information, gathering it from different places. But if you come through to the site and your site doesn't serve that purpose, again, you're going to switch off. And during the process of website design, ultimately what we find is that user research does happen, obviously, at the beginning, when we're looking at UX or kind of website design. However, what we can sort of typically do is we get overtaken away with the idea of actually building, like let's get through the build phase. Like, that's really important when we get started. These things take time. It's a time-consuming process. So let's just start with getting things moving. Let's get the wireframes designed. Then we'll move on to the content modelling. Then we'll build the site, and then we'd look at the content afterwards. Which, as I say, isn't necessarily what everybody's doing, but typically we do see this quite commonly. And website design can then end up being driven by the functionality of the CMS you're using. Well, it doesn't work like that, therefore we can't offer that. It's what is the easiest to build. So again, from a development perspective and even from a human perspective, these are all human elements. So it's easy, what's the most straightforward, what's the simplest route. And we do it based on what we think the users want, because we ourselves, it's about, oh, well, I would like this experience on the website. In fact, I went to a meeting the other day and the whole kind of approach that, oh, well, I don't like this, I don't like this. And it's like, well, actually, does the consumer care? Like, do they like that? Because with the greatest of respect, you're not the user. Because then if we actually translate things and move that content modelling, which we're going to talk a little bit more in detail around kind of that idea of what kind of content strategy are you putting forward up front, and actually prioritising that over the, building the wireframes before you've even really considered what content you're putting out there, you're ultimately designing for the consumer first. And that content first, so what we want the consumer to see, the customer, the user, combined with the behaviour, so what do we want them to do on the website, will ultimately lead to those conversions, whatever that conversion might be. That's a lead form generation, that's a purchase, whatever that might be, which ultimately is all encompassed with your CMS, because that's actually going to be the method of which your content is going to be delivered. But as humans, like, so why do we make bad decisions? How many times have we sat there and been like, well, this doesn't make sense. Like, we've got this amazing product, no one's buying it, or, you know, it's just not resonating, it's not landing, and it can be incredibly frustrating. But why does that happen? Ultimately, decisions are rarely rational. So we use things like mental shortcuts, which I'll cover in a little bit more detail, emotion, which I think is hugely undervalued, particularly in the B2B space, where people think, oh, no, you know, emotion comes when you're buying a product, or you're buying clothing, or you're buying a holiday. Emotions come massively into every decision that we make. And the context, so what is the surrounding context behind what the decision we're making? Because, again, that's going to massively impact the process that we go through mentally. And most decisions are system one thinking. Now, system one thinking are your emotive, again, effortless and unconscious. So that's decisions that you go through that you're not even, you just have no awareness. Like, you'll come out with the response, but you're not necessarily even aware of how you've come to that decision. And between 90 and 95% of our decision-making processes are this system one. Leaving only sort of 5, maybe 10% into the systems 2, which is your rational. It's a demanding thought process, and it's more conscious. You're sitting there, you're thinking about this, actually, what am I doing in this instance? So if you think about the 2, you know, there's a huge reliance on that system 1 thinking, which we do need to consider, but when we're designing our content on our sites, we do need to consider that system 2. Sometimes I think we do typically focus more on that system 2 thinking and maybe not so much on system 1. And if we think there's estimated 35,000 decisions, choices that we make on a daily basis, our brains can't possibly cope with that. I mean, that astounds me. So our brains ultimately are wired to try and find methods and routes to reduce the effort that's taken. Because if you think about how much tiring it is when you're having a conversation with somebody, it takes a lot of effort. If you think about your brain trying to do 35,000 other things and then have a conversation with somebody, huge amount of effort. So mental shortcuts will help people solve these problems quickly and efficiently, and limiting the cognitive demand on their brains, which ultimately influences decision-making. So we've got some really good examples here of these sort of heuristics. So we've got effects, so relying, again, emotions rather than objective, rational thought. So it could be that, you know, I don't like the feeling, or I have had a bad experience with a brand that's sort of similar to this, or a person, like even how many times in like meetings you think, oh, you know, that person, I don't like that face. That's actually going to really impact my decision-making process, and that can be sort of imagery or video or content. Default, so this is a common one, you know, this is why we use pre-selected defaults on websites, because actually people don't want to have to think about it, and actually if it's quicker for me, you've made the decision for me, I trust you, okay, I'll go with it. And anchoring, people will typically rely on that first piece of information, which is why that first impression is so important, because ultimately that's going to really impact that decision-making process. And this then leads on to your cognitive biases. So this is the systematic way, an error that your brain then processes information and leads typically to flawed, but not say always flawed, thought decision and decision-making processes. And these, some good examples again of these happening in our day-to-day sort of framing effects. So the way that information is presented to us will have an effect on how we then interpret that information. And you know, I've got various of the talks precisely on just this topic. Even if we think about this from a reporting perspective, how that information is presented to someone has a massive impact. Confirmation will come in with a preconceived idea. Does it match what I've already considered? You know, that could, again, you're going to have an uphill struggle to battle against that. And authority, which obviously we see a lot of, people will be influenced and trust with figures that they consider as being in a position of authority, regardless of whether what they have to say is true or not. That will obviously have a massive impact, and we see that obviously in politics regularly. So our brains rely on these heuristics and biases down to cognitive load, as I already said. So our brains have got so much to try and deal with, they need ways to try and elevate that, to try and reduce the impact. So cognitive load is actually broken down into 3 elements. So your intrinsic load, which is the inherent difficulty and the complexity of the task. So how difficult is the content itself to actually comprehend. We then move on to the extraneous load. So this is the amount of effort that's required due to the poor design, if we're in the context of content of the website. So if your website is difficult to navigate, the content is difficult to digest, then that's additional load that's already been added on. And then when you're in a situation, as you said, you're trying to encourage people to take action, trying to solve a problem. And a lot of that might be education, like this is the solution to your problem that you're trying to solve. So how do you, the individual is not only trying to understand like what is the content itself, if they're trying to navigate the design of the website, they're also then trying to understand how do I integrate this new information into the information I already have in my brain. But we can help reduce that load, which is why we're here today, to use principles of choice architecture. So choice architecture is about nudging decisions without limiting choice, and that's super important. So we're not trying to encourage an action that's maybe is negative or not what someone is wanting to do. It's not about that. It's about trying to reduce the friction and the effort that's required for someone to make that decision. So it's really designing that environment. And you may have heard of nudges. I've got some nudge cards if you want to come and find me after the talk later on, which are will give you an idea of how you can encourage those actions and the sort of language you might want to use, or the sort of approaches you can use to try and encourage that decision and action. So designing for load, some simple examples. So for intrinsic load, so again, the actual effort to actually understand the content and engage with that. So progressive disclosure, don't give everything out in one go. Actually, just take the time to gradually introduce that information. Chunking it, so don't have huge amounts of content there that people aren't going to read. Break that down into manageable chunks. And then the different mediums, what mediums are you using? Are you using video? Are you using imagery? Are you using diagrams? Is it written text? For extraneous load, so reduce those distractions. So remove pop-ups. I will talk a little bit more pop-ups about shortly, but I went on a website the other day. There was a product that I'd seen on social media, went through to the site. I couldn't even look at the product that I wanted to see because it was constant pop-ups. Do you want a discount? Nice, thank you for joining. We want to get your subscription, give us your email address. It was just too much. And then I was like, I'm done. I can't be dealing with this. Streamlining the navigation, again, we're going to give some examples here where the navigation, it is your shop window, but at the same time, you can't give it, not everybody wants to see every single thing that you've got on offer. And it's really important to design that navigation in a way that is not overwhelming and limiting the information of a similar nature. And then from a domain load perspective, interactivity, worked examples, and micro-learning. And again, it might seem really obvious if you're in a learning space, like this is a learning product, or we're trying to, but actually you're potentially trying to teach people constantly. Whatever you're offering, you're trying to encourage teaching them why your product is the solution to their problem. So think about how you can introduce those learning examples and those learning approaches within the content. So some examples here. So this is a Nido, which is an student accommodation brand. And it was a really simple change here where actually when you're searching for where availability is, now you might think, well, we want to show everybody all of the properties that we ever have, whether we have got availability or not, but we want them to know that we do have a property in that location. From the customer's perspective, they don't want to know that. They want to know where is the availability, what am I actually trying to see? By reducing the options based purely on where there was availability, so huge improvements in that customer journey. And then for the parenting club, interactivity again, so this is with encouraging people to learn more about what options, what support they've got from a parenting perspective. And using 3D digital experience, again, really supports that. So rather than it just being sort of static content or written content, actually create something that is more engaging, more interactive, will really support that learning experience. As I mentioned, so poor friction, it will negatively interrupt the user's flow, so things like unnecessary steps. If the interface is confusing or the performance of the website is really slow, again, it's going to be an issue. And we've, again, saw this similar issue with Carter Jonas, and I think this is a classic one. We've literally 2 weeks ago had the same conversation with another brand discussing the navigation and what information you present. And it's that demand of the business wanting to present the right information based on the priorities of the business. Well, I want my department to appear high in that navigation because I want to make sure that I'm not losing visibility. But again, balancing that with what the customer actually wants to know and see about. It's about understanding that journey, because ultimately, if you're presenting the information in a way that makes sense for the business, you're not giving an experience that makes sense for the customer. And with here, there was a sort of structuring of the categorization on the navigation with the arbitrary layout, essentially, which actually with updating that more related to the customer's requirements, saw huge improvement again in that experience. But friction doesn't always have to be bad, as I mentioned. So your confirmation pop-ups, like I'm not saying pop-ups are a bad thing necessarily. Are you sure, like when someone's deleting something from a basket or deleting an account, are you sure this is what you want to do? That's fine, that makes sense. You're giving people that moment to stop and think, which actually is also super important. Form validation, again, you need this information. So if they fill out this form and you don't have that, it's a waste of time. So you're going to create a poorer work experience yet again, because you've then got to go back and say, sorry, but we also need this information. And multi-step processes actually have got a huge amount of value if you're then going to kind of break that down. So creating some of that friction isn't necessarily bad. So again, I hear a lot of friction's bad. It's not necessarily bad. It's how you use it and the relevancy of it to that customer journey that you need to get right. So if we think about it, the role of content is to persuade. That is what we're trying to do, to make those consumers make those good decisions. that it's not just to inform. So again, we can think about it from the perspective of we're just trying to give them information. No, we are trying to persuade them. Again, what language do you need to use for that persuasive conversation? But in order to persuade, we need to understand why they're on your site in the first place. And there will be different motivations. Regardless of what your product is, there will always be different motivations. And we always look at persona development and creating those audiences based on motivations, not demographics. Demographics have some value, but they aren't going to tell you the full picture. And we then use the jobs to be done framework, which is a framework for behavioural science, to understand the customer's needs. So we're going to break this down a little bit. So ultimately, what are they trying to achieve? They're trying to solve a problem. What are they trying to do? They're not just buying a product or a service. They are hiring somebody to solve the problem. So they'll have that existing behaviour. So they might be buying from an existing competitor, or maybe they don't use the product at all. It's not something they've really considered. A push factor will be the situation that they're in has instigated the need for a new solution. So maybe they haven't needed it up until now. The business has been a certain size, or I haven't actually needed that product. The pull is the opportunity of the new solution. So how is this going to make my life better? And that will all drive change towards the new behaviour that you ultimately want them to do. But on the contrast, you've got habit. So people's current habit, which is going to inhibit that change. This is what I've always done. We hear that classic. They've always done it this way. It's just easier. Anxiety, that worry of concerns of the potential change. And again, this is a huge factor. And I think this is really interesting when you think about, again, from a human perspective, when you're trying to engage with a new product, if you're, as an individual, again, I use a B2B example because I'm really passionate about the fact that, emotion and personal attitude really comes into this. You're thinking about, I want to look good in front of my boss. And if I bring in this relationship, is it going to go well? What if it doesn't go well? How do I make sure that I've done all the due diligence I need to in order for this to look right? So that's really going to have an impact. And understanding how, how they're inhibiting the change. You've got these two conflicting directions. You have to try and balance those different needs in order to be able to see that new behaviour. And this is a framework which obviously you'll be able to access the slides and you can utilise. And we break these down to these jobs to be done into functional jobs, emotional jobs, social jobs, and personal jobs as well. Because again, there's such a layering of what you're trying to achieve. You can break that down into tasks. Got one task here, but however many tasks you think that needed. And then break down to habit, those push, pull, anxiety. What do you think is happening at each of those stages? What impact are these areas having on that decision-making process? Because once you've got that information, you can then start to design your website and content in relation to that. And you can understand how to influence their decisions ultimately on that customer journey. And we also use the COM-B model, which you may be familiar with, which essentially COM-B stands for capability, opportunity, motivation in order to derive a behaviour. If you don't have those capabilities, opportunities, motivations, the behaviour will not occur. And again, it's a classic one where you say, oh yeah, obviously it's a really obvious journey. Yeah, they know how to sign up, but do they? So we use a COM-B model, and again, you can use this to sort of think about it, like capability questions. Do they understand the process to submit a lead? Yeah, it's really obvious. Well, you might think that, but actually go through it, have a think about it. Do they know how to fill in the required fields? Do they know why you require those fields? Is the form easy to find on the page? Is it flowing with them? Is it, oh yeah, it's really obvious. Is it at the top of the page? If they're at the bottom of the page and it's at the top of the page, I'd argue that's not. Are the trust signals clear? And then is the benefit really obvious? Is the onward journey clear? Like when I've submitted my details, now what? Like, is that obvious? And you can connect those needs with the outcomes and in order to drive those conversions. So if we take the capability questions to start with, so do they understand the process? Is there a content of content related to the process available to them? Are there guides? Are there checklists that maybe they need? From a process, is it simple and is the language really clear? So think about from a behavioural perspective, like you might be using business terminology, but is business terminology the right terminology for that particular audience? Like actually, do they understand what you're talking about? What frameworks do you need to put in place to help content development? When you've got any required fields, I was on a site the other day where they wanted the name as it appears on your passport. Why? Why is that important? Like it was like, I don't understand why you need that. It wasn't for passport reasons. So I don't understand what that necessity is. And that can actually be like, well, that's a bit invasive. And like, why are you asking me that? And now I'm not sure if I want. And you're breaking that chain of like, I'm going through this process. And then I was like, actually, I don't know how I feel about this. So explain, why do we need my name as it appears on my passport? Why is that important? And then accessibility, massively important, obviously for particularly when you're looking beyond the UK, accessibility requirements, but we should be doing this anyway, from my personal opinion. opinion. The amount, having a website that is accessible to everybody can only be a good thing. Creating, making sure the fonts are the right sizes, colours, the contrast is correct. Ensuring that you have, your imagery can be read by the read-write software that's required. I think, I'm, again, really passionate about this. I think it's super important, and there's a huge amount of business opportunity there, as well as just being the right thing to do as a human. And then this really takes you from those sort of tactics through to that strategic framework. So let's look at some quick examples. So this is with Christian Aid, so ways to donate. Original page, quite simple, which you might think, okay, great, that's simple, it's clear, it's obvious. We then tested a variant where we gave people the options, like what is it that they're going to get for their donation? How can they donate? What are the ways to do that? We created predefined defaults so that we obviously had given them the opportunity, or they can select their own amount. And off the back of that, we saw a 19% increase in conversion rate off the back of those simple changes. So it's they're not necessarily groundbreaking, but look at the value that you can deliver just by trying to understand what is needed. And then we've got another example here where we tested sort of widget and in this instance, image removal. So again, like you might think, well, they need all this information. Do they though? Again, test it, understand what they're trying to deliver. And here we saw a 70% increase in revenue donations and an average donation value of 86% increase. We then did another subsequent test on top of that, with copy changes, where we adjusted the text. And on top of the original improvements, we then saw subsequent increase again of revenue and then the average value. But the main thing here is about the incrementality that you're delivering. It's about making those incremental improvements in that journey and how you can actually then impact that. But really understanding, and I think testing is hugely undervalued, and it can be quite scary, and I think it's really important for us to have that, establish that mentality of, testing is good. You either test, you learn, or you win. And that's okay. It's not about win or fail. So where does your CMS fit in? So because we're looking from the perspective of monolithic CMSs or headless CMSs, as John mentioned earlier, if you want to chat about headless CMSs, then do come and speak to us afterwards. But essentially, with your monolithic setups, your CMSs, they are easier to use. There is a centralized. There are positives. However, they do really limit personalization. The number of times we've talked to, oh no, the website, CMS doesn't support that. Sorry, we can't do that. It limits the scalability. From a headless perspective, whatever headless CMS you want to use, the adaptability of the design, the ability for you to create that omni-channel consistency because you can roll it out easily over different channels, it creates that, it's so much easier, and it does mean that you're then able to deliver a better user experience for your customers. The downsides, because we have to cover all the bases, there are those multiple vendors, it is a potentially more complex architecture, but I would always argue that the value you're going to deliver from a customer experience perspective, the lifetime value, the overall improvement in the engagement is massively going to outweigh, any of the negatives that we've presented here. So really think about, when you're looking at what CMS I'm using, really prioritise, like, how is the design going to adapt to the consumer and the content that we need to, is it a seamless user flow? Are we delivering that omni-channel consistency across email, social, website, app? Because that really is the answer, isn't it? It's that power to personalise and how you can actually deliver that experience. Because it's all well and good having the persona data. And again, this is a classic. We've got these personas, fantastic. They're up in the office, wonderful. How are we using them? Well, we can't really, because we don't know how to engage with them. We don't know how to personalise. You really need to connect the dots between the research and insight and then the actual personalisation. So if we think about how we're going to instigate that long-term change, first of all, centre of excellence from a behavioural perspective, and making sure that you've got those teams that really understand the customer and like those principles. Now, there's lots of ways to get that insight from a behavioural perspective. You don't all have to, people have to have psychology degrees or behavioural science degrees or behavioural economics. Having that enthusiasm, that interest, there's lots of content that's available. Encourage people within the teams to really start to understand their customers better and what are the principles that they can use, because it is accessible. Even though it might seem like this is a scientific background, you can get that insight. Establishing the integration opportunity, so build the principles within the processes you've got. So from a content perspective, how are you then going to build in behavioural science into that process of creating content? Because ultimately, if you don't have it in those processes, it's really easy to slip back into the way that we've always done it, because that's the straightforward and easy way to do it. How do you make that easy for your teams? And an experimentation culture. So again, as I've already stressed, humans do behave unusually in many instances. You're like, this is going to work. And a number of times, this is a great campaign, really good. We're going to see fantastic results. Oh no, hang on, it's not landed. Why is that? That's fine, but now learn from it. What do we think the problems are? What do we think the challenges were? And take it back to a behavioural perspective to really understand why is it we think that customers haven't engaged the way we expected. So hopefully I've given you plenty of food for thought, covering a variety of different topics. So the importance of understanding why. Why is your customer on your website? What is it they're trying to achieve? What is the problem they're trying to solve? How can you influence that customer journey? By understanding the push, pull, the influence, the anxieties they might be experiencing, you're going to be able to understand, like, within that customer journey, what do I actually need to do in order to change positively the behaviour and intervene with that particular behaviour. And then what models you can use. We've talked about jobs to be done model and combi. Both are relatively straightforward. So we've given you some examples. Take those templates away. Have a go at kind of building that from your website. Or even with the combi model, the combi example, you can just ask those questions yourself. Sit with your team. Okay, I'm going to go through these questions. Can we answer these questions? Yes or no? And we did that with Storyblock actually a couple of months ago, which is really interesting again, because it's like, when you've asked me that directly, that question, yes, I did think that was okay, but now you've asked me it, I'm not entirely sure, so I'm going to go away and have a think about it. Because at the end of the day, we're driving business growth, so we're delivering that customer lifetime value. By having a really positive customer experience, you're building trust, you're building loyalty. Customers want to return to you as a brand. They're not doing it because it's easy, they're doing it because they actually have that emotional and vested connection with you. Improving that customer acquisition, which we know is constantly, is going up with the costs of a lot of the channels that we're using. So how can we maintain those customers on site, that loyalty, and reduce that customer cost? Brand perception, hugely valuable. So the brand, the esteem of the brand is going up in people's opinions. You're going to have improved reviews on your website, because not only because of the product that you've sold them, but just the experience they've had before they've even bought it. And that increased market share. So ultimately, if you're creating those key differentiators, you're really focusing on that customer and drawing in from your competitors. You're focusing on what you're doing, but also aware of what's going on around you. Ultimately, you're going to deliver that better experience. So what to do now? Conduct a jobs to be done audit with the framework that I've shared with you. Have a go. You can't go wrong with it. It's just sit down with the teams, have a little bit of a play. Outline that main customer journey, because again, it's really daunting when you think, I've got all these personas and I don't really know where to start. Think about the primary customer journey route you've got through your site. And then identify who those behavioural champions could be in your business. Who is it that you could really say, you know what, this is a subject I'm really interested in. How do you help enthuse them? Because ultimately, that's just going to kind of propel itself through the business if you've got those key people who are really pushing forward. And you'll be able to sort of, scan the QR code to get the slides after the talk. But hopefully you've enjoyed the session today, and thank you so much for joining me.